Sometimes, life changes in an instant. Not with a warning. Not with a slow build-up. But with the sudden knock of authority on your front door. That was the reality for one Arizona family. On a warm spring afternoon, when the sun dipped just low enough to cast long shadows across the quiet streets of Mesa, two police cruisers rolled into a modest neighborhood. Their engines hummed low, deliberate. Their flashing lights were off. But for the family inside the small, brick-front home at the corner of El Dorado Drive, those quiet vehicles carried a storm they could never have imagined. Inside the house, the Ramirez children were getting ready for school. Four siblings, ages 6, 8, 10, and 12. They wore navy uniforms with white collars, their hair neatly braided and tied. Their mother, Elena, had ironed their clothes the night before. She always did. No matter how tired she was after a late shift at the hospital, she made sure her babies were ready. Their father, Miguel, had just returned from a 12-hour shift at a distribution warehouse. He was exhausted, his boots still dusty from the concrete floor, but he lingered near the kitchen table, sipping lukewarm coffee, smiling at the children as they bickered over who would sit closest to the window on the school bus. To anyone looking in, they were just another working-class family. Struggling, yes. But holding on. Proud. And then, came the knock. It wasn't a gentle tap. It was firm. Rhythmic. A sound that made Elena freeze mid-step, a dish towel in her hand. She opened the door. And standing there was not a neighbor. Not a delivery driver. It was two uniformed police officers, flanking a woman with a clipboard and a laminated badge that read, Arizona Department of Child Safety. "Mrs. Ramirez?" the woman asked. Her tone was official. Cold. Rehearsed. Elena's heart sank. "Yes," she managed, gripping the doorframe as though it could steady her trembling. The woman continued, "We have received a report of neglect in this household. We are here to take custody of the children." The words landed like a bomb. Miguel dropped his coffee. The mug shattered on the tile. The children, sensing the tension, drifted toward the doorway, their eyes wide, their little bodies clustering together like sparrows in a storm. "What?" "No, there must be a mistake," Elena stammered. Her voice broke. "My children are fine. Look at them. They're clean, they're fed." But the officers were already stepping forward. Miguel, desperate, tried to shield his family. "You're not taking them. Not without proof, without." One officer raised a hand, his expression stoic. "Sir, step back. We have a court order." And there it was. A piece of paper. Signed. Stamped. Giving strangers the power to shatter a family. The youngest child, Sophia, just 6 years old, clung to her mother's leg. "Mama, what's happening?" she whispered. Elena knelt, cupping her daughter's face with trembling hands. "Stay calm, baby. Mama's here. Mama's here." But tears blurred her vision, spilling freely as the clipboard woman moved closer. The officers led the children outside. Four little bodies in navy uniforms, walking in a straight line between badges and authority. Neighbors peeked through curtains. Phones appeared, recording. Some whispered. Some shook their heads. Others simply stared, silent witnesses to a tragedy playing out in broad daylight. The Ramirez children were placed in the back of two waiting vehicles. The doors slammed shut with a finality that made Elena collapse onto the front lawn, screaming until her voice broke. Miguel stood frozen, his fists clenched, his chest heaving. He wanted to fight. Every muscle screamed at him to do something. But one wrong move, and he knew the cuffs would be on his wrists. And then his children would not only be gone, they'd believe the worst about him, too. The cars pulled away. Four faces pressed against the glass. Tear-streaked cheeks. Wide, terrified eyes. And then, they were gone. Viewers, imagine this: you've worked every day of your life to provide. You've sacrificed. You've struggled. And yet, in less than an hour, everything you love most in this world can be taken, not by criminals, not by fate, but by the very system that claims to protect. For the Ramirez family, that spring afternoon was not just a tragedy. It was the beginning of a fight that would span years. A fight that would reveal corruption, betrayal, and the devastating truth about how fragile parental rights can be in Arizona. Because the question that haunted everyone who saw those children being taken was simple. Why? Why did the state believe these parents were unfit? And who was behind the call that triggered it all? The answers would prove darker than anyone imagined. When a child is taken from their parents, most people assume it must be for a good reason. Abuse. Neglect. Violence. Something unforgivable. But what if the truth is far more complicated? To understand what happened to the Ramirez family, we must first understand Arizona's child welfare system. A system designed to protect children, but one that has, time and time again, been accused of breaking the very families it claims to serve. Arizona has one of the highest rates of child removals in the entire United States. In fact, at the height of the crisis in the mid-2010s, nearly 1 in every 100 children in the state was living in foster care. That's tens of thousands of kids. Why? Officials point to meth epidemics, to generational poverty, to border state complexities. They say Arizona has unique challenges: families stretched thin, overwhelmed by drugs, by unemployment, by despair. But advocates whisper another truth: that poverty itself often gets mislabeled as neglect. Picture this: a refrigerator with only a carton of milk and leftover rice inside. A child wearing shoes with holes in the soles. A home where the electricity has been cut off for 2 days because the bill went unpaid. To some caseworkers, those details can trigger the ultimate intervention: removal. Not because the parents don't love their children, but because they are poor. It takes only one anonymous tip to set the wheels in motion. A neighbor. A teacher. A stranger. Anyone can dial a hotline and report suspected neglect. From there, the Arizona Department of Child Safety, or DCS, as it's known, is legally required to investigate. And once an investigation begins, the family enters a maze of bureaucracy where the odds are stacked heavily against them. In Maricopa County, where the Ramirez family lived, caseworkers carry crushing caseloads. Some oversee more than 25 or 30 children at once. They juggle reports, court filings, home visits, and endless paperwork. Overworked. Underpaid. Burned out. And when those caseworkers knock on a door, their decisions can change lives forever. One veteran caseworker later admitted anonymously, "We're trained to err on the side of removal. Because if you leave a child in a home and something happens, your name is on the headline. But if you take them away unnecessarily, nobody gets fired for that." Think about that. The system incentivizes taking children, not keeping families together. Over the past decade, Arizona's DCS has faced lawsuits and public scandals. Asterisk cases of children left in abusive foster homes. Asterisk families torn apart over minor infractions. Asterisk parents completing every program ordered by the court, yet never getting their children back. And then there's the money. For every child adopted out of foster care, the state receives federal funding incentives. In other words, the system benefits, financially, when children are not returned to their biological parents. Critics call it a pipeline. A quiet, bureaucratic machine that feeds on broken families. So where did the Ramirez family fit into this? To neighbors. Miguel and Elena were quiet, hardworking people. Their modest home was clean, their children polite. But they were also struggling. Late bills. 2 parents working long shifts. 4 children sharing hand-me-downs. And then came that anonymous call. A report that the Ramirez children were often left unsupervised. That the house was dirty. That food was scarce. No one knows exactly who made the call. Some whispered it was a disgruntled neighbor. Others believed it came from within the school. But once the report landed on a caseworker's desk, the outcome was almost inevitable. The caseworker arrived. She saw 4 children in uniforms, backpacks ready, shoes slightly worn. She saw bills stacked on the counter. She saw a tired mother and an exhausted father. And in her eyes, perhaps, she didn't see resilience. She saw risk. Within 48 hours of the report, the department filed a petition in juvenile court. The request, immediate removal, citing unsafe living conditions and potential neglect. It didn't matter that the Ramirez children had never been hospitalized for injury. It didn't matter that their teachers described them as bright and well-mannered. It didn't matter that Miguel had just picked up a second job to cover overdue bills. The judge signed the order. And once a court order is signed, dear viewers, it carries the full weight of the law. That's why, on that spring afternoon, 2 police cruisers rolled down El Dorado Drive. Not to respond to a crime. Not to protect children from abuse. But to enforce the judgment of a system that, perhaps, had mistaken poverty for neglect. Neighbors who witnessed the removal were divided. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Elena loves those kids. I've seen her walk them to the bus stop every morning. Others muttered disapproval. If the state stepped in, there must have been a reason. You don't just lose your kids for nothing. And that's the haunting reality. Once a child is taken, the stigma follows the family. Parents become suspects in the court of public opinion. For the Ramirez family, the nightmare had only just begun. In the weeks ahead, they would face hearings, accusations, and impossible requirements. They would fight to prove their worthiness, not as employees, not as citizens, but as parents. And looming over every step was a single, painful question. Would their children ever come home? Behind every courtroom order, every official file, there are human beings. People with histories, with scars, with dreams. And sometimes, those details, the small struggles, the whispered rumors, are exactly what the system seizes upon. To understand why the Ramirez family became a target, we must look back at their lives before that spring afternoon. Miguel Ramirez was born in Tucson, the son of immigrant parents who had crossed the border decades earlier with nothing but determination and hope. From a young age, Miguel carried responsibility on his shoulders. At 13, he was already working weekends at a mechanic's shop, handing every paycheck to his mother. By 17, he dropped out of school to work full-time at a warehouse. Life taught him early that survival meant sacrifice. Neighbors remembered Miguel as a quiet man. A man who rarely complained, even when his back ached, even when his paychecks never seemed enough. He worked 12-hour shifts at a distribution center, often pulling nights, his boots caked in dust, his hands calloused from hauling pallets. And when his paycheck fell short, he picked up extra jobs, painting fences, hauling furniture, whatever he could find. To his children, Miguel was the rock. The one who fixed bicycles, who tucked them in at night when he wasn't on shift, who whispered, "Mija, work hard and you'll never go hungry." But beneath that steady exterior was exhaustion. And exhaustion, dear viewers, can look like neglect to the untrained eye. Elena grew up in Mesa. The daughter of a nurse, she followed in her mother's footsteps. At 23, she became a licensed practical nurse, juggling long shifts at a retirement home. She was known for her patience, her soft voice, the way she treated every patient like family. But caregiving came at a cost. When Elena gave birth to their first child, she was already stretched thin. By the time the fourth arrived, she was working nights, catching only a few hours of sleep between school drop-offs and late shifts. Her love for her children was unquestionable. She ironed uniforms, packed lunches, helped with homework, often with tired eyes and trembling hands. Still, In the eyes of outsiders, exhaustion could look like disorganization. Dirty dishes in the sink. Piles of laundry waiting. Bills stacked on the counter. And when a caseworker enters a home with suspicion already in their mind, those details become ammunition. Miguel and Elena's home was small but full of warmth. Birthdays celebrated with dollar store decorations. Family dinners of rice, beans, and laughter. Saturdays at the park, children running barefoot in the Arizona sun. But behind the smiles were the cracks. The electricity shut off twice in the past year. Rent overdue more than once. A missed doctor's appointment that raised the school nurse's concern. To a struggling family, these are hurdles. To the system, they are warning signs. And then came the whispers. A neighbor complained about loud arguments. A coworker hinted Miguel might be drinking too much after shifts. A relative suggested Elena was overwhelmed, that she sometimes left the children with older siblings while she worked. Were these exaggerations? Misunderstandings? Or truths twisted into weapons? The official case file noted reports of possible substance abuse, but no tests were ever conducted. It mentioned concerns of inadequate supervision, though the children's teachers never filed such claims. Rumors, half-truths, and assumptions began to paint a picture. Not of loving parents doing their best, but of a family under suspicion. Then came the phone call. An anonymous tipster reported the Ramirez children were often hungry, left alone, living in a dirty home. Viewers, remember, no proof is required to make that call. No name attached. No consequences if the report is false. All it takes is suspicion, or malice. Was it a neighbor tired of the children's laughter in the yard? Was it a coworker with a grudge against Miguel? Was it a family member, angry over some long-buried feud? We may never know. But the call was made. And the system moved swiftly. On the day before their children were taken, Miguel and Elena sat at their kitchen table late at night. Bills spread out before them. A calculator. A stack of unopened envelopes. Miguel rubbed his temples. "We're 2 months behind again," he muttered. Elena sighed, her hands trembling. "I can pick up another shift. Maybe nights. But then, who will watch the kids?" Miguel reached across the table, taking her hand. "We'll figure it out. We always do." They had no idea, dear viewers, that their conversation was already irrelevant. That a petition had already been filed in juvenile court. That a judge's pen had already decided their children's fate. The Ramirez family wasn't perfect. They struggled. They stumbled. They argued. But neglect? Abuse? Those words carried a weight they never imagined would be attached to their name. And as dawn broke the next morning, the wheels of bureaucracy turned without mercy. The cruisers arrived. The knock came. And their children, their life, their legacy, were taken. All because of whispers, poverty, and a system that believed suspicion was enough. But the story doesn't end here. Because what came next was a fight. A fight that would pit 2 exhausted parents against the full machinery of the Arizona Department of Child Safety. And dear viewers, in that battle, the truth about the system would begin to unravel. When children are removed from their homes, the system uses a cold phrase, placement. A child isn't taken. They're placed. But for the Ramirez siblings, placement meant one thing only, separation. The Ramirez children were loaded into state vehicles. Sofia, the youngest at 6, pressed against her brother Diego, who was 8. The older 2, Maria and Javier, sat in another car. The ride was silent, save for muffled sobs. Their small faces pressed against the tinted glass, watching the only world they had ever known shrink and disappear behind flashing red taillights. They arrived not at a warm foster home, but at a state intake center in Phoenix. A squat, beige building with buzzing fluorescent lights and linoleum floors that smelled faintly of bleach. Inside, the children were led to a waiting room with plastic chairs. Other children were there too, clutching garbage bags stuffed with their belongings. Some cried. Some stared blankly at the wall. It was not a shelter. It was a holding cell for the innocent. Sophia asked the question no one could answer: when do we go home? The caseworker avoided her eyes. Soon, she said. But her voice carried no conviction. Diego tried to be brave. He wrapped an arm around his sister. But his voice shook when he whispered, "Don't cry. Mama and Papa will come." Maria, at 10 years old, felt the weight of responsibility. She sat upright, hands folded, watching everything with cautious eyes. Later, she would remember the details: the flicker of the overhead light, the tired sigh of the security guard, the vending machine humming in the corner. And Javier, the oldest at 12, clenched his fists. Anger simmered beneath his tears. He wasn't confused. He was furious. Furious at the strangers, furious at the system, furious that he hadn't been able to protect his siblings. That first night, they were given paper-thin blankets and told to sleep in a room with other children. A guard paced the hall outside. The Ramirez children huddled together on a mattress, whispering promises into the dark. "We'll be home soon. Mama's coming. Papa won't let them keep us." But as the hours passed, the reality sank in. They were alone. The next morning, the true cruelty of the system revealed itself. The siblings were split apart. Sophia was placed in a foster home in Tempe. Diego was sent to a family on the west side of Phoenix. Maria went to Glendale. And Javier, too old for some foster families to accept, was sent to a group home. Each child left clutching a small plastic bag with the few belongings the state had gathered. Their clothes. A toothbrush. Nothing more. The screams echoed through the intake center as they were pried apart. Sophia clawed for her sister's hand. Diego shouted for his brother. Maria sobbed as strangers pulled her away. And Javier, the eldest, shouted at the caseworker, "You can't do this. We're family. You can't take them from me." But the doors closed. And the siblings who had spent every day of their lives together were scattered across the city like pieces of a broken puzzle. Foster homes vary, dear viewers. Some are warm, loving places. Others are not. For Sophia, the youngest, it was confusing. Her foster mother was kind, but she wasn't Mama. The meals were different. The smells were different. At night, she cried herself to sleep clutching a stuffed rabbit, whispering Elena's name. Diego's foster placement was harsher. He was one of 4 foster children crowded into a small bedroom. The foster father barked orders, meals were rushed, affection was scarce. Diego stopped speaking after the first week. Teachers noticed his silence. They thought he was shy. In reality, he was breaking. Maria tried to adapt. Her foster mother encouraged her to do chores, to be a good helper. Maria complied, but at night she scribbled letters to her mother in a notebook she kept hidden under her pillow. Letters she had no way of sending. And Javier, his group home was little more than a warehouse for boys. Rules, routines, punishments. No softness. No hugs. Just survival. Javier learned quickly, keep your head down, don't show weakness. But inside, the rage grew. Weeks turned into months. Visits with their parents were scheduled, then cancelled. Promised, then postponed. When the children did see Miguel and Elena, in cramped visitation rooms with supervisors watching, the meetings were short, filled with tears, and ended with heartbreak. Sophia clung to her mother's waist, screaming when the hour was up. Diego stared at the floor, refusing to speak, his silence louder than any words. Maria tried to stay composed, telling her parents she was okay, even when she wasn't. And Javier, his jaw tight, whispered only one thing as guards led him away: don't stop fighting. Psychologists say that for children, separation from parents can feel like death. The grief is real. The wounds invisible. The Ramirez children began to change. Sofia developed nightmares, waking up crying for her mother. Diego began wetting the bed. Maria withdrew into books, escaping into fictional worlds where families stayed together. And Javier, his anger hardened. He began lashing out at staff, fighting with other boys, daring the system to punish him. They were no longer just children. They were wards of the state. And in Arizona, wards of the state often became statistics, lost in a system too big, too broken to care for each individual heart it shattered. But the Ramirez children never forgot. In whispered prayers before bed. In drawings of their family taped to bedroom walls. In letters tucked under pillows. They remembered who they were. And they remembered the promise their parents made. We'll bring you home. 2 weeks after the removal, Miguel and Elena sat in a juvenile courtroom in downtown Phoenix. The room was sterile. White walls. A judge's bench raised high above them. A court clerk tapping at a keyboard. Dear viewers, if this story moved you, don't let it vanish. Hit that like button, share it with someone who still believes in justice, comment below for part 2. And subscribe for more stories where the truth always finds its voice.